G'day and welcome to another gun review video on my channel. We're doing a revolver today, and this is a Webley Mark IV 38 caliber revolver. Now you note I said Mark IV 38. We'll come back to that in a minute because this is not the only Mark IV Webley revolver. So the Webley company started in about the 1850s in England, based in Birmingham I think. Like a lot of gun making was there. In 1853 they produced their first cap and ball percussion revolver. It's subsequently become known as the Webley long spur for obvious reasons if you look at the photos. As you can see, the long spur is an open topped revolver similar to the early Colts, and it also has a wedge retaining the barrel to the frame just like the early Colts. A little bit later on you will see that they transitioned over to a solid frame percussion revolver, and then the first cartridge revolver produced by Webley was known as a Webley Price. The Price was a break action revolver similar to the Smith & Wesson revolvers of the day, and you'll see that that general type of action and extraction was kept throughout the full history of Webley's production of revolvers, the break action design. The Webley Price was introduced in 1877. It was unique in that it had, unlike this one, it had a locking lever on both sides of the revolver, which both had to be pushed at the same time in order to unlock it. It also was new in that it had a rebounding hammer. In 1881, Webley started manufacturing a different design of revolver. This one was known as the Webley Kaufman. Now it was different to the Price in that it went back to similar to the later Webley's, just one unlocking lever that's done with the right thumb. Also had a rebounding hammer, but it was different in that the lockwork was different, whereas the Price, when the revolver was at rest, there was nothing stopping the cylinder to be turning and getting out of sync with the next cartridge. The Price had a better designed cylinder locking system where the cylinder was locked and was unable to be turned, and so therefore when the revolver was ready to shoot it was always going to be on the correct cylinder. Those were commercial revolvers, but then of course, like all gun companies, Webley wanted to get government contracts. In 1885, Webley developed their first military style revolver, which they called the Webley WG, which was thought to stand for Webley Government. It was released in 1886. On the revolver it was marked Webley WG Army model, so clearly aimed for military, but it was a revolver that was made to an extremely high level of precision, fit and finish, much more than would be expected for something that was going to be adopted by the military. So it was probably more aimed at the wealthy army officers who wanted to purchase the very best revolver that was available at the time. So in 1887 they produced the Webley Mark I, which was their first military revolver that was adopted by the military. Of course in Britain it was very different everywhere else. Officers had to buy their own sidearms usually because it was mainly officers that carried sidearms. But yeah, the Mark I was produced in 1887 in 45 caliber. These are all black powder. All of these ones I've been discussing thus far, black powder cartridges in 45 caliber. Even the cartridges were developed over this period of time, and I'm not going to go into that either. There's plenty of information on the net if you're interested in the different Mark I, II, etc. cartridge developments. But anyway, they went through, from 1887, they went through Marks I, II, III, IV, and then there was the Mark V, which was a big, really big revolver, 6-inch barrel in 45. The British cartridges tend to be called the 455. At the start of World War I, the standard sidearm was the Webley Mark V. And then in 1915, so not that long after the start of the war, they were upgraded to the Webley Mark VI, and that was the standard sidearm during World War I. The main difference, I think, was they actually changed it from a bird's head grip to a grip like this one, a square grip. So they served during the First World War. Then after the war in the early 1920s, I think, because warfare obviously changed from the late 1800s through the trench warfare of World War I, then we started to have the development of tanks and all that, and machine guns. The actual role of the revolver sort of changed a bit, I think. You know, early in the 1800s, you had your British colonial forces in places like the Sudan and South Africa, where, you know, they were fighting, you know, hordes of tribesmen, and there'd be the officer up front with his sabre and his Webley, would be leading his men. It was important to have, you know, the officers didn't carry a rifle, so they'd carry a revolver, but they needed still to be able to have close quarters self-defence. And then we had the First World War, where they were doing these trench raids, where the officer would lead his men into the trench, you know, and he'd have his revolver, his big 45 Webley Mark VI, storming the German trenches. You needed something with a bit of punch. But of course, a lot of revolvers are also carried by other people, truck drivers, people behind the lines, and messengers, and etc., who just needed something to carry. And the big 45 Mark VI is a honking great revolver. I'll see if I can find a photo of one of these next to a Mark VI so that you can actually see the difference. In the early 1920s, the military decided that they needed to find another standard sidearm for the British military that was just smaller, and of course the big Mark VI Webley, for someone who wasn't an accomplished pistol shooter, was difficult to shoot well as well. They decided they needed to get something smaller, but there was the whole thing about, we still need the knockdown power. After a lot of testing, shooting pig carcasses and that sort of thing, it was decided that a 200 grain bullet in .38 caliber at I haven't got the actual velocity in my mind, would be just as effective as a 200 and so 455. I'm not sure what the standard 455 bullet was. I'll put it up, but similar sort of weight, not that difference in weight. So a big slow 38 would be as effective, and they could chamber it in a smaller, physically smaller, lighter, easy to carry, and easy to shoot revolver. So that was the general idea. Of course, the government put out a call for tenders for a revolver that fit these specifications. So Webley designed this revolver and presented it to the government, and they called this the Webley Mark IV 38. So now we've got two Webley Mark IVs. We've got the original Webley Mark IV military revolver from the 18, whenever that was. It was probably in about, the Mark V came out in like the early 1900s. So the Mark IV would have been like the late 1890s, I think. 455 caliber, big honking revolver. And then this one is the Webley Mark IV, but it's the Webley Mark IV 38. So what Webley did was they had a range of pocket pistol, well, not really pocket pistols, they had a range of small frame pistols which were designed for commercial use, and they were designed to be sort of fairly small and fairly concealable. So the same frame as this, so they built this on the same frame. So the one that they redesigned to produce the Mark IV was the Webley Mark III 38 pocket revolver. So as you can see, a small frame, they tended to just have like a 2 or 3 inch barrel, and they had the rounded, smaller, shorter grip. What Webley did basically to produce this Mark IV 38 revolver was use the same frame, same barrel profile, put a longer barrel on it. The standard military barrel is 5 inch, which is this one. You'll commonly also see these Mark IV revolvers, the commercially sold ones for police and just private use, in 4 inch and even 3 inch, but the rest of the revolver is the same. And then what they did is they just basically copied the general design principles from the Mark VI large frame revolver. But other than that, same sort of design. So you've got your lever here, push that down, unlock the revolver. As it goes down, the extractor comes out, and then it goes over center and it snaps back. And because the cartridges are quite short, by the time it gets to there, the edge of the cartridge is already out, so when it snaps back, it tends to make the cartridges go flying. It's just a quick snap and they tend to just all go flying out, and then you can reload and then you're ready to go again. So instead of adopting this, they said to Webley, oh no, sorry, we're not going to adopt that. And what they did was they designed a suspiciously similar revolver at the Enfield Arms factory. They called it the Pistol-Revolver No. 2 Mark I, and that was in 1932. Webley wasn't obviously very happy about this, so they actually took them to court, took the government to court. I'll see if I can find a photo of one of these and an Enfield revolver side by side, so you can kind of make your own mind up. Not that, you know, you can see the internals. But according to Enfield, the new revolver was actually designed by Captain Boys, who was the Assistant Superintendent of Design. Now, that name Boys, you may have heard of that. Another thing that he designed was the Boys anti-tank rifle. And so the government, of course, sided with their own Enfield factory. The Webley and Scott claim was denied. But later on, a few years later, the Royal Commission on Awards, it might have been after the war, I'm not quite sure. The Royal Commission on Awards later awarded Webley and Scott £1,250 for their contribution to the war effort, I guess. Yeah, but of course, once they designed it, even though it wasn't adopted by the military, initially anyway, they continued to market it for police and civilian use, and it was very popular. Now this one in fact has no military markings on it, even though it's a 5-inch Mark IV 38, so it's exactly the same pattern as the military pattern, but it's got no broad arrows or anything on it. So it was either simply a commercially purchased revolver, or more likely here in Australia, you know, because even by that stage handguns were pretty well regulated. More than likely it was actually purchased either by a police force or possibly something like a bank or an armed guard company or something like that which used it. Now during the war, so once the war was going, I'm not sure the exact, I'll see if I can find a year for you, but Enfield was producing their No. 2 Mark I revolver. Oh, and actually, that wasn't actually correct. So the No. 2 Mark I came out in 1932. In 1938, Enfield modified the design to the Mark I Star. Now the difference with that is that it actually became, they decided that there was going to, you know, because of the nature of what it was for, it was, now I'm not talking about the Webley now, I'm talking about the Enfield one, the competition. The Mark I Star became a double action only hammerless design, so they bobbed the hammer and adjusted the sear engagement on the hammer so it could only be fired in double action. That was in 1938. In 1942 it became the Mark I Star. Now if you're familiar with British military nomenclature, if they made a major design it became a different mark, but if they did minor design changes to some sort of military equipment, they just added a star to it. So it became the Mark I Star, which just meant it was simplified for wartime production. I'm not sure what that involved, but some minor changes just made it cheaper and quicker to produce. Now during the war, the government Enfield factory had problems producing enough of the Enfield Mark I Star and Mark I Star. So they came back to Webley, hat in hand, and said, oh, excuse me Webley, you know, do you think you could make us some revolvers that we can buy from you? So Webley kind of probably went, okay, you know, they're going to be this much, you know, because he ripped me off last time. But anyway, so Webley they got a contract for these, and so they started making them for the British military. Now, after a period of time, again, just like the Mark I Star Enfield revolvers, the government wanted to get Webley to produce them more quickly and more cheaply, so there was a few design changes were made. The main one though is what was called war finish. Now if you look at this revolver, it's nicely blued, you know, it's a typical Webley and Scott commercial revolver up until, you know, right up until the Second World War, so this kind of quality of finish and bluing. But during the war the government was happy to have a lower standard of finish, so they developed what's called a war finish, which is, I'm not exactly sure what, it's almost like parkerization. And they were actually marked war finish because Webley and Scott didn't want their reputation tarnished by producing revolvers with crap finish and people going, oh, that's crap looking revolver. So they actually marked them war finish to differentiate them from their standard production. So during the war, the British government bought 126,000 Webley Mark IVs. I'm not sure when they stopped purchasing them, possibly the end of the Second World War, possibly a bit later. British obviously adopted the Browning high power at some stage during that period. The Webley Mark IV remained in British service right up until 1963, and probably in other Commonwealth services as well. Let's have a bit of a closer look at the Webley Mark IV 38. First of all, let's maybe have a look at the markings, if we can actually read them. Hopefully that's focusing. So we can see here, Mark IV 38, specifically says Mark IV 38 to distinguish it from the other Mark IVs. We've got your standard British view proof, British proof and nitro proof here on the barrel. And then if we look at the cylinder, let's just open her up. We've got British view proof alternating with a British proof on the 6 cylinders. So if you're not sure what the difference between a view proof and a British proof is, I'll link up the top to my video on an introduction to proof marks. So we've got a view proof on the frame here. What else? Nothing under there. Turn around. We've got the serial number here across the bottom, and then we got the Webley and Scott with the flying bullet. That's their trademark. So the other marks, obviously, we've got the Webley symbol on both grips, and then if we look at the top of the frame, Webley and Scott Limited. So let's have a look at the controls. We've got our cylinder latch lever. Now there's only on one side. This is obviously only designed for a right-handed shooter, really, because you can use your left hand to open it up like that, and then holding it with your left hand, you can then put cartridges in. So as you can see, we open it up and the extractor comes out. Try to keep this in frame for you. And then it gets to a certain point and it snaps back in again. Now I'll show you why that happens. If we look underneath the revolver, between the barrel and the frame here, we can see that little curved lever, I guess you call it. It is a lever. And you can see that spring loaded. See that? Now, if I open this in that position, it's a bit awkward to do. There we go. Now, so I've sort of just got it just open now. So if you look at that lever, you can see it's got a curved section and then it's got a flat section. And as we open the revolver, the flat section has just caught on the edge of the frame, and so that's stopped it from moving. So what that means is that lever is now pushing on the bottom of the ejector. So as we continue open, it's pushing the ejector up. Now if we go back around to here, keep an eye on this little lever here. Hopefully it stays in focus once that barrel's trying to get the barrel out of the way. Keep your eye on that. So it sort of disappeared, didn't it? You sort of saw it disappear, then you heard it go click. But what actually happened was, as it came around, because that's curved, this part of the barrel here, as it came around, gradually pushed that down until it got to the point where it actually slipped off the front of the frame. You can't really see it because it's kind of closed up by then, but it slipped off the front of the frame, which then released the extractor and let it snap back in. One thing you'll notice is, if we look at this general design of the revolver layout, it's almost exactly the same as the old Mark VI 45 revolver from the First World War, just on a smaller scale. And you'll see that there's these two things here. Now what they are for is for when you put the revolver into a holster, it stops it getting caught on the front of the cylinder, opens the holster up. You know, you've got a leather holster or canvas holster, opens it up so that the revolver goes in. So that's its main function. It does have a secondary function, however. The other function that this thing here has, it's actually all one piece, as you'll see in a minute, is actually retaining the cylinder. So if we want to clean the revolver and take the cylinder out, what we do is we can actually leave it closed for now. So I'm just going to remove those two screws. I won't film this because it's just a bit awkward. All right, so we've got those two screws out now. There's the screws there. You see they're just a little stubby screw. So if we now open the revolver as normal, pushing the lever, as you can see, it comes out. Once it clears the frame, you can see this is actually disengaged from the bottom of the cylinder, so the cylinder actually just comes off. So I can clean the cylinder and I can clean the revolver from the rear, and then this little part here just comes off like that. So that leaves that there. So that's as far as we have to go for disassembling for cleaning. We've got the trigger guard held on by a couple of screws there to the frame, a bit of longitudinal machining for grip on the grip. We've got a lanyard ring which will rotate on the grips. Grips are Bakelite, plastic, some sort of plastic. The spring for the thumb catch is just here, you can see. So if that ever broke, it's actually reasonably easy to remove. It's just a matter of taking out that screw there. The catch would come off and that spring would presumably come out then, and it could be replaced. The barrel has this nice, what's the thing that really makes it look like a British revolver is that it has this scalloped machining on the barrel just to lighten, reduce weight. Has just a curved hemispherical front sight, but this one shoots to point of aim at 25 meters, so the sights are actually pretty good. Rear sight, so there's a sort of a sight picture of the front sight in the night. So not bad sights really for its time. So all the Webleys are single and double action. So we've got single action, we've got a floppy firing pin on the hammer. And then if you watch the hammer, we've got a hammer rebound there. And then double action is, it's reasonably heavy, but it does, I don't know if you heard then, it'll go up and then you can actually hear your bolt lock into the bottom of the cylinder. There was a little click and then just a tiny bit more will fire it. Double action, as you saw, it's actually quite heavy, but it's actually quite smooth, so you can do rapid fire fairly well. The single action is not too bad. One thing it is a bit different to my Smith & Wessons is that it's got quite a heavy hammer spring, and you got to kind of make sure that you pull it all the way back. And the trigger pull, it's not as light as a Smith & Wesson or similar, but it's not too bad. As you can see, I can kind of hold it fairly still without moving it. Yeah, all in all, the actual action is reasonably smooth and single action is good. And as you would expect on a revolver like this that's used by, you know, conscripts and people with no training, you expect a fairly heavy trigger pull, but it's heavy that's smooth. So now we need to talk about the 38 cartridge that was used in the Webley. Now what the British did was they obviously wanted this cartridge that initially fired a 200 grain projectile at about 600 feet per second. So what they did was they used the 38 Smith & Wesson case as a base for the military cartridge. The 38 Smith & Wesson, there's one there, I don't know if you can see that from here, is a fairly little short cartridge. I'll put the case length up on the screen so you can compare it to like a 38 Special 357 Magnum length. But one thing that you have to know, and I must admit I didn't realise this until I got this, is that the 38 Smith & Wesson cartridge is not just a shortened version of the 38 Special, or going the other way around actually, because the 38 Smith & Wesson came out in the 1880s, I think. I'll look it up and put the year on the screen, but the 38 Smith & Wesson is one of the older 38 cartridges, and then the 38 Special is actually called the 38 Smith & Wesson Special initially. That came out later, but for some reason, I'm not quite sure why, the 38 Special is not just an elongated version of the 38 Smith & Wesson. The 38 Special has a smaller case head, and instead of being 357 diameter bullet, the 38 Smith & Wesson is about 361, so it's bigger. So you read in the forums where people just cut down 38 Special cases to use in revolvers chambered for 38 Smith & Wesson, and apparently you can do it at a pinch, but they're actually a lot smaller than the cylinder, so you risk getting split cases, and the bullets are undersized for the bore, so you're unlikely to get good accuracy. So what the British did was they got a 38 Smith & Wesson case, they put a big 200 grain round nose bullet on it, and a fine pistol powder, and it fired the round at about 600 feet per second. After a while, I'm not sure, I'll put the year when the upgrade came, but maybe in breach of the Hague Convention. Now, if you're not sure of what the Hague Convention is, I've actually got a video on exactly the same problem, the actual 310 Cadet cartridge in Australia, and why they had to change from a lead to a jacketed bullet because of the Hague Convention. So I'll put it up here at the top so you can watch it straight away if you want, and I'll also link it in the show notes. But basically they decided that they needed to change it from a lead bullet, soft lead bullet, to a jacketed bullet to be accepted under the terms of the Hague Convention. And at the same time, I think they realised that 200 grains was a little bit overboard as far as bullet weight goes for such a small cartridge, and so they scaled it back to 178 grain bullet. But it was still, even though the bullet was smaller, you think they could have driven it a bit faster, I would have assumed so, but from my research it was still only at about 600 feet per second. So they may have just kept it at the same velocity just so that the sights would still be roughly correct for the trajectory. The cartridge used for this is now commonly called the 38/200 because it's a 38 caliber 200, just to differentiate from a standard 38 Smith & Wesson load. But I don't think it was ever actually officially called that back in the day. If you look at ammunition, boxes of ammunition from that time, you'll see they generally mark something like cartridge, revolver, .380 inch Mark 1, 2, etc. So the first cartridge was the Mark 1. That was the 200 grain lead projectile. Then when they modified the cartridge to the 178 grain jacketed projectile, it became known as the Mark II. They probably changed the powder and the loading a bit, but the velocity is still about the same, about 600 feet per second. And then a little bit later on, they actually modified it again. They just changed the bullet design slightly. It's still the same weight. Possibly, maybe the velocity may have changed a bit. I'm not really sure about that. That cartridge was designated the Mark II-Z. And that was the cartridge that was used throughout most of World War II and afterwards. So now, where, like I said, you'll tend to see it, if you see one of these advertised or something, they'll say it's chambered in 38-200. There was other revolvers as well, of course, chambered in the 38-200. The one that comes to mind, of course, is the Smith & Wesson Victory model, which was a similar size revolver, a K-frame Smith & Wesson revolver. It was bought by the British from Smith & Wesson. They were also here as well, and that was also chambered in the 38 cartridge. You will see commercial cartridges sometimes, especially kind of early post-war ones made by Connaught, for example. They actually designated the 38-200. I guess just to make sure that everyone is aware of exactly what cartridge they're selling, because if they said, say, .380 in a commercial context, of course people would be getting it confused with a 380 auto or some of the other early 38 cartridges. So I think 38-200 is just a later terminology that's just used to avoid confusion as to what cartridge it is. So when I got this revolver, I had to kind of work out how I was going to reload it, and I obviously can't show you any reloading on YouTube, but I'll just give you a general, in case you bought one of these and you just want to know where to start. So first thing to do is go and get yourself some 38 Smith & Wesson brass, readily available from Starline, and then you need to find some projectiles. Now what I did initially was I thought, because I figured that the sights are going to be calibrated or regulated, it's the correct word I think, for sort of a 378-ish grain bullet. I've got a mould for a Keith design by MKIV, 174 grain 357 Magnum mould. Now that sort of throws in a bit at about 360, and I've actually got a 358 loop sizer die, so I thought, well, I'll give that a go for a start. So I loop size some of these Keith cast bullets, cast with wheel weights plus 2% tin, and I sized them and lubed them to 358 and fired them. Now I'll show you a target I shot with these. Initially, I won't talk about any reloading data, because the powder that I use is an obsolete Australian powder that you're not going to have anyway. With these big bullets, I think you're probably better with a slower pistol powder. So go for the slower end of the pistol powders. You may have to work up loads, because there's really no loads that I could find available for these big projectiles. So anyway, then because I was getting, the bullets weren't really being stabilised that well, I wasn't really sure what it was. I wasn't sure whether I wasn't driving them fast enough, or whether it might just be because they're undersized. So I did some chronographing of the load, and the chronograph actually came out, there was a little bit of standard deviation, but it was pretty much about 700 feet per second, so I was actually driving them a little bit faster than the actual original loads, and accuracy was, for my level of shooting, was kind of okay. I wasn't doing too badly with it. So when I ran out of those, I thought, well, I really need to get a 360 loop sizer die. Now Lyman do make one, and I am planning to get one, and I'm going to revisit those projectiles, cast some and loop size them to 360. Or the other thing I might do is actually just cast some and then just Lee liquid Alox tumble lube them and give that a go just as cast, because I think they drop at about 360 or 361, so that might work out. So the reloading is still a work in progress. But then I saw a local gun shop here who specialises in Western action type of stuff. They actually had a brand of bullet that I'd never seen before, because the normal brands don't tend to make 360, they make 357. But they had some 158 grain, just pretty standard design, 158 grain projectiles, but they're actually 361. So I've loaded some of those up and I'm going to give them a go this weekend. So I haven't fired them yet. I've still, and what I did, there was actually a load in an old ADI manual that I found for 38 Smith & Wesson for 158 grain bullet, using the powder that I'm using. I didn't use a full power load, I backed it off a little bit. It was 3.5 grains, it's AP90 is the name of the powder. I've got heaps of it, I've got like about 9.5 kilos. It was 3.8 grains was the recommended load, so I've actually loaded these at 3.5. And as you can see, they're a fairly short cylinder, so they're about the right length for the cylinder. But you've actually got enough, because the cylinder's a bit longer, of course, because the original bullets were longer. So with the big 174 grainers, they came almost to the front of the cylinder. So here's just a comparison of the cartridge for the Webley Revolver, and this is a standard 38 special 158 grain semi-wad cutter. Just bear in mind that this 38 Smith & Wesson cartridge has 158 grain round nose. It's smaller than what is typical for what was used back in the day in the Webley, but it's just what I've been using recently because I was able to buy some 361 sized projectiles. So normally the projectile would be bigger than that. So as I said, the projectile's about 1/4 hour bigger than a 38, typical 38 special. As you can see, the rim is very similar size and the whole case is bigger, so in a properly proportioned 38 special chamber in a revolver, a 38 Smith & Wesson cartridge won't chamber. One thing that was worth noting if you're going to be shooting one of these, especially in competition, is that a speed loader for a Smith & Wesson K frame, this is a HS branded loader. They call it the Model 10 because it's for a Model 10 Smith & Wesson revolver or any other Smith & Wesson K frame. But as you can see, cartridges fit in there, they held in there quite well. They don't stick out very far. But when you're reloading one of these, in competition or whatever, you tend to hold the revolver with your hand and flip the barrel down. So the barrel's pointing down anyway. So you can just plonk them in there and they pretty much line up there. I don't think it's an exact, the exact size of a Smith & Wesson K, but it's kind of good enough. And if you give it the little click, as you can see, they do just drop in. So it is practical to use. Action! Identify your target. Instant. Fire! Load! Action! Identify your target! Instant! Fire! The one thing that I came across in my research, which I was not aware of, and it's definitely worth mentioning, is the fact that Webley and Scott actually have a subsidiary in India. It's Webley and Scott India. Now I don't know whether it's just they're making something under license, selling them under license, or whether Webley and Scott have always had an Indian subsidiary, you know, back in the day. Regardless of how all that actually works, Webley and Scott India are actually making the Webley Mark IV revolver. Now they're making several different iterations. I'll put the Webley and Scott website address up here, and I'll put it in the show notes as well. So if you want to look at their website, it's pretty interesting. They make a lot of other stuff as well. A lot of semi-auto pistols. But they're making the Mark IV revolver. Now you'll note that it's only offered in 32 Smith & Wesson long, not in 38. I'm not quite sure why that is. I suspect it may be some sort of legal thing where maybe it's easier to get a license for a 32 revolver than it is for a 38. That's the only thing I can think of as to why they would change it to a smaller cartridge when, you know, they're selling these pocket revolvers that should be being used for self-defense. But anyway, it's available only in 32, but it's available in a little 2-inch barrel model. I'll show you up on the screen while I'm talking about it. Little 2-inch model barrel with a little pocket revolver grip. Then there's a 3-inch model. They call it the overhand model. Now I held that photo that's on the screen. If you're looking at their website, is actually to scale. I actually held my Webley up against that one, and it is actually a full-size grip on the 3-inch overhand model. It's got a square grip just like this. And then they're also making one that they call the full-size model, still in 32. Now they call it the full-size 4-inch. So 4 inches about there. However, you know, I held mine up to the photo they got on the screen, and the one on the screen is clearly a 5-inch model. And just out of interest, Webley are also advertising a full-size Mark VI Webley in 455 coming soon, coming at the end of 2025. So that's interesting. Now I did actually, if you go back to the, while you're watching this, you might just want to open on another screen if you're on a computer. Open that Webley website. I actually held my Webley up to the picture that they've got in that photo, and there is actually some subtle changes, some subtle differences. The screw hole for this little holster retainer wedge thing is actually a bit further forward in theirs, and I also noticed there's some sort of screw. It's a bit hard to tell because the photo's not perfect, but there's some sort of screw or something just here, whereas this one's got pins. So, and also the screw for the opening lever, there's actually a screw head on the right hand side. You know, in effect it's actually the same. So I did see in an article I was reading, they said the asking price for a Webley revolver was about $1,300 US, but they come in a really nice sort of satin lined presentation case. So if you live in India and you want to buy a nice revolver in a presentation case, and you're actually legally able to, you should be able to go out to a gun shop and order it. If anyone is in India and has got one or has seen one or has any information about them, feel free to put something in the comments. I'd be interested to hear about it. So we've pretty much reached the end of our deep dive into the Webley Mark IV 38 revolver. In conclusion, it's a really nice classic British revolver. They're not uncommon. There's in Australia here. When I sort of decided to get one, or thought a while ago I wouldn't mind one, I kept my eye out. I really wanted a 5-inch one because I wanted to be able to shoot it, so I wanted the longer sighting plane. There's quite a lot of 4-inch ones here in Australia as well. It seems they come up on the gun shops and auctions. I presume most of them are just commercial ones that were owned, as I said, just like this one probably was, by banks and police and whatever. but I wanted a 5-inch one because I wanted the longer sight radius to be able to shoot it in competition. Here in our Sporting Shooters Association competition in Combined Services, they actually have a special class. It's vintage revolvers, I can't remember what it's exactly called, but the handgun has to be pre-1946, which this one is. This one's actually made, I looked up their serial number, made in 1945. You have to have an original handgun that was a military issue handgun that was made 1946 or earlier. Now here in Australia, where in most places we can't have anything bigger than 38, even for competition, that narrows it down, and we can't have revolver barrels shorter than 100 mils, 4-inch, and semi-auto barrels shorter than 120 mils, so sort of 5-inch. That sort of really narrows the number of easily available vintage service handguns that are available, but the Webley 38 is one that actually fits all those criteria. They're collectible, so you get a decent one. It's going to just increase in value as time goes by. They're great to shoot, as I've said. They're well balanced, eject quickly, quick to load, nice sights. Trigger's a little bit heavy, but that's what you get for a service revolver. What's not to like? It's a great revolver. So if you've got one, good luck. And if you're watching this because you're thinking about getting one, just keep your eye out. There's plenty out there. Go out and get yourself one and enjoy it. And until next time, thanks for watching.